All right, hey there. So I wanted to make you all a video that explains a little bit more about sort of where I'm coming from, and essentially where I'd like to start with that is, I guess, what I'd call my origin story. If I'm a Marvel character or something, this is so what made me who I am and where I come from, and sort of why I care about the things I do and sort of work on them the way that I work on them. So the short title for this talk is Place Learning Games and Mobile. And let's get started. So once upon a time, I was a mathematician. That's what I went to grad school for at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. When I was here as an undergrad at UNM, a bit earlier on, I realized that math was something that I really enjoyed doing, and that even when there wasn't, sort of the compulsion of an assignment and a grade, I was interested in learning it on my own. And so that was enough for me to keep studying it as a grad student and sort of to take that long road. And one of the things that I realized along the way, because I was also teaching math, is how the same every math class everywhere for everyone pretty much is. There's a set amount of content that the teacher's supposed to go through week to week, unit to unit, year to year. They go through it the same way. The teacher says what's in the book says what the teacher says, and then the students try and sort of keep along with what's going on and then regurgitate the methods on the test that they're asked to take. And so, as someone who was on the other side of it, being the teacher and teaching people who really didn't want to be there and doing that sort of thing, I was instantly looking for, how to maybe do this better than the way that I had been taught. And one of the things about being in grad school is that I was exposed to, a tiny percentage of math experiences that don't look like the standard classroom. So this is a picture I took at the Arizona Winter School in 2009, actually after I graduated, but is a good example of a social setting that's constructed by and for mathematicians to be a much more collaborative and productive teaching and learning environment, where the goal is to learn new things that no one else knows yet, and to work as groups to find ways to do that. And so the organization of people and time and expertise is super different in a situation like this. And this is also emblematic of the kinds of things that I was finally exposed to once I got past the last line of sort of rudimentary classes as a grad student and was asked to think and work and live on my own in terms of mathematics. And it was a very different sort of environment, and one which my previous classes didn't prepare me for at all. And so what I did was I started taking more classes in education. I made it my minor as a PhD student and took classes from people like Michael Apple and Gloria Ladsit-Millings and Tom Popkowitz. And luckily was sort of at a school where people like this could help me dig into the theory, the history, the practice of education, and try and understand on a more structural level what was going on. So I learned a lot from folks like this, but I also began to dig into the literature, and I just wanted to sort of give you some waypoints from some people you might have heard of. First of all is the sort of godfather of American progressive education, John Dewey. And here's a quote of his that I think is sort of emblematic of sort of what I took from his work. There's no such thing as educational value in the abstract. The notion that some subjects and methods and that acquaintance with certain facts and truths possess educational value in and of themselves is the reason why traditional education reduced the material of education so largely to a diet of predigested materials. Let's see, what was another one? Lev Vygotsky, of course. And the quote I pulled from him is, "What children can do with the assistance of others might be in some sense even more indicative of their mental development than what they can do alone." Let's look also at Ivan Illich, who says, most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. Most people learn best by being with it, yet school makes them identify their personal cognitive growth with elaborate planning and manipulation. And on to Seymour Papert, one of my favorites, especially if you've read some of my other work. You'll notice his stamp on my thinking. Almost all experiments purporting to implement progressive education have been disappointing because they simply did not go far enough in making the student the subject of the process rather than the object. So between these classes and between the reading that I was doing over in the education department, I began to see some of the contradictions that lay behind the difficulties of what's going on in the classroom, and to latch on to sort of hopeful words and ideas for maybe how to turn the disappointment of facing those difficulties into something better. But these were all just kind of ideas at the time. And it wasn't until I fell in line with another group there on campus that I began to make something concrete of them. On a whim, I heard about from a classmate that there was a class about video games and learning, and I thought that sounded pretty fun. I liked games when I was a kid, although at the time I wasn't playing them much anymore. But I thought, sure, why not try something like that out? And little did I know that the person who's teaching the class not only was very well known, but was getting together a group of interdisciplinary scholars at UW-Madison as like a multifunctional research group. And I was lucky enough to take this class from Jim G. and Kurt Squire right when Kurt Squire arrived on the scene. Now, the quote I pulled from Jim G. is a funny one because I think a lot of people sort of got the cheap and easy message from what he's been saying or was saying, 15 years ago, which is, he wrote a book about what video games have to teach us about learning and literacy. But what people took away from it was video games make you smart. Jim G said so. And so one of the things, for anyone who's interested in looking at games and learning, as I say, the message is more subtle than that. And it's much more about what we make of education, particularly when planning classes in school, and then what other kinds of learning structures and opportunities are out there that we might be able to learn from. So I took that class and it was very interesting, but things didn't really start to change until I followed up. I was going to talk about some of the things that were subtle in Jim G's work, some of the more important milestones rather than just saying it's all about video games. So things that he points out very clearly is that, and this is similar to my quote from Dewey, that all learning is specific to a theater. It's not generic. And sort of what you can learn from games about this is that games are their own prepackaged worlds that make sense on their own terms, and that we might sort of use as a model for how to think about how we structure knowledge in other scenarios. Games provide very quick, very meaningful feedback in terms of what a learner's learning how to do. That's an important thing about them. Games give you a chance to take on an identity. Normally when you take a math class, you take it as yourself. But games give you a chance to sort of be someone else and to understand your abilities and identity through that role that you take on. And so is another thing that, we might, as educators, want to look for ways to pull from the world of games. And then finally, the concept of affinity spaces has been super, super useful for me over the years in terms of thinking about what are the structures of people and intent and how are they organized. Especially if we want to do something better than I have been paid to teach this class, you were required to take it from me, in terms of sort of hoping that there's structures of organization that might lead to something more productive in the classroom. So anyway, that's sort of Jim G in a nutshell, or at least one piece of it. But like I said, things didn't really change for me until I followed up a year later and took a class just from Kurt Squire that was called Curriculum Instruction 801. And I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I got there on the first day and he said, everyone in this class is going to make an educational game. And that was pretty terrifying for me. I sort of had myself pegged as a pretty analytical person and not very good with computers in particular. And making something for someone else to use just didn't seem like it was within my reach. And so that was ultimately a very scary thing for me to do. But in the end, super formative for what I went on to do, and an opportunity I'm really glad that I had. Which isn't to say that Kurt Squire doesn't have anything interesting to say along the lines of these other folks, but the most meaningful thing he did for me was to give me a chance to make things. In particular, after I took this class, I sort of fell overboard with this games and learning stuff and was hanging out with the group all the time. And by the time another year passed, I was working for Kurt Squire. And I'll tell you that a little bit more about that in a minute. But I guess just to sort of think about how this works with mobile, he and Eric Klopfer were doing some initial work with mobile technologies, wondering what these little pocket-sized PDAs might mean in the future educationally. And so they took a look at the major affordances that they could think about back in 2004. And these are sort of the main facets that they came out with, that the mobile technologies were portable, that you could have them with you wherever you were, that they gave you new ways to interact socially with other people, that the devices themselves were context sensitive, meaning that the device knew something about where it was or where you were, and that could be tapped into. And then finally, the ability to connect through networks and the internet to each other, and the fact that the device that's in your pocket wouldn't be exactly the same as the device in someone else's pocket. And so this sort of key affordance of individuality or customizability that mobile devices would bring to the table that just weren't there when you're, sort of all listening to the same instruction in a classroom or having to make use of a shared computer or something like that. But anyway, after I had gotten a chance to try out making a game for Kurt, about a year later, I started working for him on a grant where he was trying to put some of these mobile ideas into practice. And this was called the Star Schools Grant. It was a big grant with Kurt Squire, Eric Klopfer, and Chris Deedy. Klopfer was at MIT and Deedy was at Harvard. So this was a big $1.3 million educational grant, and the idea was we were supposed to create game-based curricula for middle schoolers, co-develop them with their teachers, and run them in their classrooms. And so we did this. We made several games. We ran them in classrooms in Madison and Milwaukee and Boston. And that's where I got to really cut my teeth on sort of doing this work for real, and especially doing the work with mobile and augmented reality, which came to characterize so much of my work later. Here's me in 2006 holding up one of these PDAs, telling these poor middle schoolers, one day the device that's in your pocket will be capable of all these things, and we're going to try and figure out what we can make of that. That's a part of the work I no longer have to do for obvious reasons. But we would go, we would set these games. The games worked through GPS, and so we would set them outside for the most part, in places where the devices and the games that were on them, the stories that students were participating in them in, would lead them around the physical environment, the natural environment. This is from a game called Sick at South Shore Beach, which was set in Milwaukee on the shore of Lake Michigan. And the idea is that some kids got sick, and the students were playing as a sort of a multifunctional team, trying to figure out what got the kids sick. And so this was part of them doing their research as part of that team. And the games weren't just on the mobile devices. The mobile devices were used out in the field, but then the surrounding curriculum was primarily paper-based and project-based, inquiry-based. So this, for instance, is a mind map of all the things that are connected to E. coli being one of the possibilities for how the kids got sick. And these are the kinds of things that the students would create, but it was sort of all in terms of this scenario where the field trip portion was guided by this augmented reality game. Here's another artifact that's sort of typical of what the students would create to try and work through things, and it was co-developed with the teachers. And then this is a shot from the first game that I got to lead. This was Hip Hop Tycoon, which was a business simulator where the idea was to open up a hip hop franchise of sorts. And to my mind, at least, this felt like some progress. This picture of these kids doing math in their classroom looks a lot more like the Arizona Winter School than the placeholder that sort of looks like every other math classroom. You can see the collaboration that's going on. You can see the sort of fluid interaction with different devices, whether it's the PDA where the game is, or the pocket calculator, or the worksheets that allow them to sort of figure out the different costs and benefits and the economic scenarios for the game. But it was both exciting to sort of lead this game that like people really played, and then to, as a math teacher, sort of be able to create an experience that felt very different. Together, we called ourselves the Local Games Lab. So you can see here from left to right is Ming Fong Jan, who is another student with me. He was the one who made the first AR game in this series called Mad City Mystery. Mark Wagler, so you'll notice the suspenders. He was raised Amish, and for teachers that were more wary of the mobile technology, it was especially nice having him as a front man to go and say, I don't know about any of this newfangled stuff, but we're going to have some fun here. Mark Wagler was a local school teacher, and Kurt Squire, in a genius move, made him the project manager. And so we all learned a whole lot from Mark. Kurt Squire's, of course, next to Mark, and then Jim Matthews, another student in the program, and someone, all these guys became very good friends, close colleagues. I learned a whole lot from getting a chance to work with them and spend time with them and try and learn things both related to games and education and running a project, design, but also things that you never would have expected. So when we were out in these places, we would always meet people. We would find out about things like sewer systems and natural ecologies and the history of the places where we were making these games. I learned a whole lot about photography, particularly from Ming Fong, because he was such an accomplished photographer, and so much of our job was being out in these places and doing photography. So the richness of this group of people and this activity as a learning opportunity for all of us, both sort of professionally and personally, and from pretty much any dimension, is what I got hooked on in the end, and what I hoped to be able to bring to someone else some other place. And so that's sort of when I really fell in line with this stuff and became very taken with it. Now, in addition to all of the sort of other educational principles and sort of historical trends on which we based our work, this work itself, being out there and making games and playing games and making games about the places, led us to sort of, and working with Mark Wagler and Jim Matthews in particular, led us to discover another educational principle that came to be just as important, and that is place itself. So we rediscovered, in addition to these sort of big words that we were trying to live up to with our work, we discovered the idea of place-based education and started doing some reading along those lines and trying to use our work as not only chances to get the most out of educational technology and increase agency of teachers and learners, but also to contribute to an understanding and ability to live within place itself. So as an emblem of that end of things, I gave you a picture of David Orr and brought a quote from him too. A great deal of what passes for knowledge is little more than abstraction, piled on top of abstraction, disconnected from tangible experience, real problems, and the places we live and work. And so you sort of see those same themes that we saw all the way back in Dewey, but now we sort of realize what that abstraction can pull us away from and what we might want to try and return to. And in a nutshell, that's really what I'm about here. So in some future talks, I'll get into more of the work that I did after this. In particular, I'll tell you a little bit about a game that I made as soon as I landed back in New Mexico, starting in 2009, called Mentira. Um, the real fun was getting to be part of a wonderful team. In this case, Julie Sykes and I, and the people we met, the ideas that we didn't know we were going to get into, making things together, seeing how people use them, involving them in continually making the next version. It was a giant roller coaster ride, but I'll get more into that next time. I think this is long enough for now. That's my origin story, and I will talk to you again soon.